This episode was recorded prior to the inexcusable atrocities perpetrated by Hamas against innocent civilians in Israel on October 7 and the resulting casualties in both Israel and Gaza in its aftermath.
We unequivocally condemn the actions of Hamas, an internationally recognized terrorist organization, as well as the anti-Semitism that has spread globally, where the victims of this horror have been portrayed as villains by the very perpetrators of this massacre. We stand in solidarity with Israel and its right to defend itself against the threat of annihilation.
Our hearts and prayers are with the victims of the October 7th massacre, those that were taken hostage, their families, and with the innocent Palestinian citizens being used as human shields by the supposed governing body that is tasked with protecting them. We extend our sincerest gratitude to the soldiers of the Israeli Defense Force who are putting their lives on the line to rid the world of this evil. Welcome to Shaping the New York City Skyline, the podcast that explores the stories behind the buildings that shape our city. I'm your host, Brenda Slokowski, and I'm here with my co-host,
David Shamshovich.
Hello, Skyliners.
Welcome, Skyliners. Welcome, Brenda. Welcome, Camilla.
Hey, David.
Hi, guys. We are here today from the Sign and Shine office.
That's right, which is where we record pretty much every episode, so it's not that unusual, although maybe we do. I was thinking about doing a recording in somebody's bed. Would that be...
I was going to say it's helpful that we do the recordings at the office because my full-time job is just down the hall.
That's right. We're actually attorneys at Sign and Shine. If you haven't noticed, we're not real podcasters. I mean,
if you're
We are real podcasters.
you're a real podcaster.
If you're 11 episodes in and you still don't know that my full-time job is an attorney, maybe you should Google me and find out what I do because I'm a pretty interesting person.
By the way, Sign and Shine is spelled S-C-I-D-E-N. Then there's either an ampersand or A-N-D. And then Shine is spelled S-C-H-E-I-N.
I like the ampersand personally.
So do I.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the ampersand. I'm not sure why. It feels like it's a good separator.
Plus, it saves 2 letters when you're typing.
Well, if you've been a Skyliner for a while, you've heard us talk with a lot of cool, impressive, interesting individuals who have long histories in housing, development, financing, design, all walks and shapes of life. And we're going to continue doing that. We're going to hopefully get some people from government and potentially elected officials and other developers and things like that.
Today we had someone who was former government. Does that count?
I think it might count. We're getting closer. He was a former HB commissioner. He has positions on boards of many
housing
organizations.
He basically
Let's
was
go with
involved in
organizations.
Organization.
He basically was involved.
Brenda.
He basically was involved in every single organization that helped the community.
Yeah, I mean,
He was involved in the
Mount Sinai Medical Center.
Thank you.
Right.
He was the chairman of the
Thank
board
you.
of the New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation, which is the nation's largest public hospital system. Actually, I didn't get into this with him, but he's an adjunct professor at the Mount Sinai School of Public Health. I didn't get into that, so maybe we'll have to
have him back.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to have him back. He was very interesting. It's Richard Roberts.
And guys, we found the applause button on our recorder.
Richard is, he got a BA and a JD from Yale. He's originally from Ohio, and he's currently works at Redstone Equity Partners as Principal and Chief Business Development Officer, originating and managing developer relationships throughout the country and developing new development strategies for his firm. Specifically, he deals a lot in low-income syndicating of low-income housing tax credits. For those in our audience who are clueless about what that is, you're more than likely not alone, but
he'll explain it for
Richard. Yeah, Richard goes through it, and he goes through his entire experience, the history of where he came from, how he came from 2 people who were part of the education system, and from there he's been involved in the intersections between public and private sectors, and how they work together throughout his career thematically, and that's something he talks about. He's going to talk about the housing crisis, how he sees it, which is not terribly unusual, but his experience and the types of developments that he's seen, his experience in government with the mayor, HPD, is enlightening. And it really goes into and explains or justifies, it buttresses. Why am I using such a complicated word? It supports.
I said to David yesterday, I was like, you're very verbose. You can keep going. And he didn't know if that was a compliment. And this is a perfect example of how that is a compliment and how you are very verbose.
Well, thank you. I have a thesaurus. I can't even say the word. A thesaurus next to me, and I just look up synonyms all day.
It works for
mean
you?
the internet?
The internet? Yeah, there's a thesaurus on the internet. But Richard, I'd met him at the Nice Alpha conference, and Alvin had known him, and that's how we got him on the podcast. And he was...
our trade secrets.
Maybe we could edit it.
Okay.
Part of the conversation. And he was so, I mean, what does he stand at, like 6'5" or 6'6"? He was towering over us.
So, by the way, I didn't wear heels today.
Neither did I.
And all of a sudden, he comes into the office and I had to look up at him.
And I think you're in for a real treat. We spoke with him for a very long time. He was so gracious to come in and make himself available. And his experiences is truly unmatched. Although I probably have said that a couple of times.
Yeah. You know, I would define Richard using his own words that he used for someone else. He's doing well by doing good. He's helping the community.
Yeah.
He's meeting in the middle to try to get both sectors happy and benefiting from his actions and his development. I think he's doing great.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I can't wait for our Skyliners to hear more.
That's right.
God, that really...
So if you want to see how Richard Roberts is making a contribution to shaping the NYC skyline, it's time for you to stop what you're doing, stop multitasking,
And pay attention.
pay attention to every single word. In fact, take notes if you need to. And then once you've taken notes, take those notes and make it into a review of our podcast, giving us 5 stars. We love our Skyliners and everybody. Please let me introduce to you our interview with Richard Roberts.
Hello, David. Hey, Camilla. How
Hey,
are you
guys.
guys today?
Hey, Brenda. Hey, Camilla.
How are you guys doing today?
Another one in the books, guys. Look at us growing. Side and shine. Shaping the New York City skyline.
One podcast at a time.
One podcast at a time.
Is that all it takes? Is one podcast?
We're
At a time.
Be
to shape
optimists.
to shape. Okay, I didn't realize.
Well, it's one.
These
it's a
people that
trip.
built all these buildings could have saved a lot of money.
They could have.
It's more of a metaphorical shaping.
Okay, I get it.
We're shaping it in many metaphorical ways. There's no physical. None of us can actually, put a nail and a hammer together and actually build something out of it.
I
Hey, speak for yourself.
Wait, but hold on a second. What are you building, Brenda?
I hung some pictures over the weekend. I got some IKEA furniture that I built,
Wow.
Yeah, and I got this strange prophecy about a flood, so I started building this ark and gathering one of every
look at
animal.
you.
Oh, that's
Wow,
good.
so Jewish.
Call a super. Call a super. Call a super. That's me. Call a super.
God comes to you and says, "There's going to be a flood. I'm going to get rid of all the bad people."
Call a
the
super.
super?
Call a super.
I'm the same way, by the way. It's like at this point, I don't know how to. And if I do, I'm doing it
I'm
wrong.
such a disappointment to my 87-year-old dad who, can fix a car, can paint your house, can, build when I was visiting him recently, we took an air conditioner out of a window that he had bolted in. And I was like, how did you even know how to bolt it in? And then he forgot that he had bolted it in. But then he figured out how to get it out. And I was just like, call the super. Call the super.
It sounds a lot like my mom. She will do like anything. And she's like, I need to teach you this. So my tire blew the other day. And I was like, Mom, can you rescue me? And she's like, I'll teach you what to do. So she drove just to tell me what to do.
Oh, okay. Your mom. I need your mom's number. Roadside.
Yeah, right?
Probably a little cheaper than AAA.
You must know how to change a tire at the very least.
I can do that. I prefer not to.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
If you think about it, most of the time that you have something like that happen, it's not ideal conditions. Like you're on the FDR.
Right.
Ooh, do you really want to do that?
Right.
You're in the middle of a rainstorm or a snowstorm. Do you really want to do that? It's kind of with cell phones, just call, wait it out, have somebody come.
Yeah,
I'm with you.
I'm the same way.
Well, Skyliners, the new voice that you hear today is Mr. Richard Roberts.
I was going to do a little bit more of a formal intro, but
Go ahead.
I can still do it.
Go ahead. I just wanted to use the new applause
That's
button.
I love the applause.
It's new.
It's a brand new applause button.
I'm like Lady Gaga. I live for the applause.
Yeah.
I love it.
They're fans if you hadn't.
We are.
If
We
you
love the
hadn't.
pop culture references also. Like, that's a huge pull.
We do a lot of pop culture. This is the only way that we know how to relate. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You've heard his voice. it's a man that needs an introduction because you're so under the radar, and yet the experience that you have is, at least for me, you're under the radar because it wasn't something, the companies, the things that you've done are so historic. And I'm going to go through a few of them. You're originally from Ohio, which to me is already impressive.
Yeah.
Graduate of Yale, both a BA and a JD. I don't even know what those are, but I'm sure they're very impressive. And also,
we're sitting in Sight and Shine. You don't know what a JD is?
a Jewish doctor.
There you go.
My mom always wanted one of those. She got a lawyer instead. He's
Second place.
maybe a distant third. He's the executive vice president of NYSAFA and serves on numerous boards, including Breaking Ground, New York State Association for Affordable Housing, Citizens Housing and Planning Council, AMBA. My goodness. I don't know.
Preservation Corporation.
Yeah, I didn't want to name all them because as much as I love, that's right, the Community Preservation Corporation.
You're rolling in the accolades.
Yeah.
Yep.
You were the former HB commissioner, which by itself would be super impressive. And you started Goldman Sachs Urban Investment Group. And then eventually you went on to work for Redstone Equity Partners, where you're currently the principal and chief business development officer.
Yes.
I want to welcome everybody, Richard Roberts.
I really love our new applause button.
That is 3 applause buttons. That has to be a record. I guess it is a record because it's new.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm really, really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, we really appreciate you being here. You and I had originally met at the NYSAFA conference when we ran into each other. Yep. And you knew Alvin Shine, the partner at Sight and Shine, where we were attorneys. And when I met you, you just struck me as so interesting, well-spoken, and really just, you had a presence about you. And Alvin told me about you because I wasn't familiar, and I was even more impressed. And I said, I have to
I appreciate that. That's very nice. Very nice. And it is great to be here. And I've heard a couple of your episodes, and so I'm excited to dive in and chat.
Us too. And we like to start from the very, very beginning. I know you're in Ohio, but what was your upbringing like? What was your family like?
Both my family is kind of a typical example of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North. You may not know this, but Akron, Ohio is the rubber capital of the world. At one point, just about all of the tires produced that were placed on cars were produced in Akron, Ohio. That was the industry that kind of attracted people and the jobs, and that kind of drove the economy in Akron. So in Akron, which is about 35 minutes south of Cleveland, Cleveland was a steel town. Akron was a rubber and tire town. Pittsburgh was a steel town, so we're about 2 hours west of Pittsburgh. And so obviously we're in close proximity to Detroit. I think Detroit is about 3.5 hours the last time I drove it. And so the cars, the steel, the tires, all kind of in that Detroit to Pittsburgh Rust Belt corridor. And Akron is really part of the Cleveland metro television market. And so I am a long-suffering Indians, now Guardians, Cavaliers, although not as long-suffering with the Cavaliers because we did win a championship in 2016, and Browns fan. So I carry that very proudly, my relationship with the Cleveland sports teams. But my parents, their families came to Akron. My mom's family from Huntsville, Alabama. My father's family from Milledgeville, Georgia, came to Akron, worked in the rubber factories. My dad, when I was born, was actually a short order cook in the B.F. Goodrich cafeteria and was going to college at night. I distinctly remember as a 5-year-old going to my dad's college graduation, where he graduated from the University of Akron and then went on to teach in the public schools, became a principal and a central administrator there when he retired. And my mom was a kindergarten teacher and a reading teacher for 35 years in the Akron public school system. So one sister, a lot of brick house, a lot of trees, pretty quiet. Nothing much happens there other than, or happened there when I was there, other than the local economy being totally decimated by the rubber industry failing in Akron and them doing a pretty good job of kind of reconstituting the local economy there. But that happened pretty much after I graduated from high school. I went to high school at a place called Akron St. Vincent St. Mary, where I am by no means the most famous graduate. Our most famous graduate is a guy by the name of LeBron James. And
never heard of him.
And we are very proud of our association with LeBron. And he has been a phenomenal supporter of the school and been incredibly helpful. Everything at the school is named after LeBron James. LeBron James pencils, the LeBron James coffee cups, the LeBron James arena, the LeBron James English books. I mean, it's out of control what he's done there.
But you're a close second.
Oh, sure. If there is one, yes.
Time to rebrand the market.
Exactly. So I was minding my business one day in the school cafeteria. There was a recruiter from Yale who was in the cafeteria. I think I was the only student who walked up to him. He said to me very simply, you should apply. One of two things is going to happen. You'll either get rejected or you'll be accepted. And that turned out to be true. And I got accepted. I had never been further east than Pittsburgh. The only reason I had been to Pittsburgh was because I was a high school debater of some note in the state of Ohio. My partner and I were pretty successful high school debaters, and we went all over from Pittsburgh to Chicago to Lexington, Kentucky to Cincinnati, my junior and senior year of high school in these national debate tournaments, and did pretty well. And I actually had scholarships to go to college to debate. That was actually a thing. They paid full ride, the whole bit. But I decided, not Yale. So I decided to go to Yale anyway, went to Yale, and the rest is history. Went to undergraduate there, majored in history, went to law school there, lived there for 7 years, and then came to New York.
What made you want to go to the law school there after doing history?
Well, it's funny. I actually got interviewed when I was a college senior about this very question. And it was an interview in the Washington Post. And my parents said to me that they had invested entirely too much money in my education for me to teach. So that was off the table. I came to New York and started to major in history because I wasn't any good in math. And I was interested in history. And I didn't know what I was going to do with it. And I had a difficult time getting a job. And I said, you know what? Let's just keep the education thing rolling. And again, applied to Yale Law School, got in, and
no easy feat. Congratulations.
Did that. And when I graduated from law school, I came to New York to work at a place called Davis Polk. I had spent a summer
fancy
at Piper and Marbury in Baltimore, a summer at a place called Alex Brown, which was an investment bank in Baltimore. Really liked Baltimore. Baltimore was kind of, for a kid from Akron, was kind of, it had a similar kind of feel to it. It wasn't DC, but it was close enough to DC. And it wasn't overwhelming. But when I came to New York my third year summer and worked at Davis Polk, I really enjoyed it. I loved New York. I had some good friends who were here. And Davis Polk was a great place, a great firm. People were incredibly nice. I mean, it was just we worked hard, but it was an environment I like to call aggressively collegial. People were nice. They asked each other questions. They kept each other informed. They over-communicated. They had great clients. You worked on interesting stuff. And I just learned a lot and would have stayed there. But in my first year of law school, Yale made a transition from, the president was a guy named Bart Giamatti, who went on to become the commissioner of baseball and died while he was I had been commissioner for a couple of years and then died of lung cancer. Guy was an incredible chain smoker. But he was replaced when he left to take over baseball. He was replaced by a guy named Benno Schmidt, who just recently passed away, actually went to his memorial service last week. Benno and I developed a relationship when I was a law student. His first year was my first year in law school. I developed a relationship with him as a law student because my second year of law school, I continued to live. My entire experience at Yale, other than my last year, I lived in university subsidized housing. So Yale has something called a residential college system. I lived in the residential college system as an undergraduate. My first year of law school, they asked me to be a graduate resident affiliate to continue to relate to undergraduates. I lived in the undergraduate dorm as a first-year law student. My second year of law school, I was what was called a freshman counselor. So I help freshmen navigate. We now call them first years. As my kids have gone to college, graduated from college. So I help first years navigate the Yale College experience as a second-year law student. And that year, one of the students kind of casually mentioned to me that they had never met the university president. They were curious about what the university president did. What do they do all day? And I said, well, let's find out. Let's invite him to lunch. And I was responsible for 15 first years. I went over to the president's office. I said, I have some first years who'd like to have lunch with him. They said, sure. He came over. We had lunch. And he and I kind of hit it off. And my third year of law school, I was recruited by the rest of the students in the school to moderate a diversity strike. There had been an incident of someone defaming or defacing a Glad Week poster. at the school, and the students decided to shut the school down. So we shut the school down for 4 days, had a sit-in at the school, and I was the moderator. And
what do you do as a moderator for?
You make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. You make sure everybody is respectful. You make sure that, we hear everybody's viewpoint. You have to kind of know people well enough to say, I know David thinks a little differently about this than Brenda might think about it. So, David, would you be willing to come up and talk to us about what you think? And so we did that for like 3 days. And I said, well, let's get the university president in to come in. And so I sent an emissary over and I said, they sent a note. Richard Roberts would like you to come over. He came over. He spoke to everybody. He had a marvelous way about him, which is he had this kind of, political ability to say a lot, but really say nothing. A lot of words, but they didn't really, there wasn't a lot.
I know those kind of people.
Yes, it wasn't like concrete, but it
is a good ability to have.
And it's a great ability in a university president, as you can imagine. So we got through that. I'm working one day at Davis Polk, and you guys are too young to remember this, but there was an above the fold New York Times headline. Yale president resigns to join an education company called the Edison Project. And the Edison Project was the brainchild of a thing called Chris Whittle, who was an educational entrepreneur who started something called Channel One, which was the first time that news was piped into classrooms in high schools through a kind of closed circuit television system. This guy had been phenomenally, he's from Knoxville, Tennessee, had been phenomenally successful with this business. Clarisil had actually totally disbanded their marketing budget in radio, television, and print to exclusively advertise on their acne medicine on Channel One because it was a captive audience. And he was the inventor of something called place-based advertising. So he was the person who, for example, suggested to Delta Airlines that in your Delta lounges, don't put magazines, don't put Sports Illustrated and these other magazines in your airplanes and in your lounges. Put the Delta magazine in. That's only about Delta stuff.
Yeah.
He invented that. That's how you reach a targeted audience. They're already Delta people. They're on your flight. So he brought this place-based advertising to the schools. And then he said, you know what? I'm going to create a system of schools. And he recruited this guy from Yale to leave his job at Yale to join this thing. And that was very intriguing. And when I saw the headline, I said, that's interesting. That's my guy, Benno. And I called him up and I said, I'd love to come over and talk to you about this. He said, sure, come on over. And by the time I left that office in the Seagram building, I had agreed to go work there. And I went back to Davis Polk and I quit my job. And I went to work for Benno Schmidt and Chris Whittle. And that involved going out and talking to public school systems about the Edison Project coming in and managing either all or some of your schools, most likely through the form of a charter school contract. And so we spent a lot of time on that. And I was there for a couple of years. And one of the reasons that I liked what Edison was about, one, I had grown up with these public school educators who that's kind of what I knew growing up. And then secondly, I've always been attracted to industries and work where there's an intersection between the public and the private. And so everything I've done since that point has involved an intersection of the public sector and the private sector. Not the public sector on its own, not the private sector on its own, but private sector companies that are in highly regulated, highly government involved, public involved industries and areas of government where there's been a strong reliance on the private sector for partnership. And that's been the theme. That's been what I've done. At the time, before I left Davis Polk to go to Edison, I had also sent my resume into the city government. David Dinkins was mayor, and to just see what might be available. And I never got a call. And one day, because Edison was hard, it was a novel idea. It was a slog. It was Milwaukee.
You're going basically across all states,
over,
right?
All over the country, talking to people who some were receptive, fighting with teachers' unions at the local level who hated this idea. It was a tough thing. And it took a long time for Edison to get any traction. And so I got a call one day from the new Giuliani administration. Got a call from a guy named Randy Mastro, who was a deputy mayor in the administration, who said, hey, we found this stack of resumes that the Dinkins people left behind. Saw yours. Would you come in and talk to me? And so I went down to City Hall, talked to him. And I think if it had been any other job, if it had been kind of a straight government job, again, with that intersection in mind, it might not have been as attractive. But he introduced me to a guy named Richard Schwartz, who was in charge of what was called the Reinventing Government Office. And so they were looking for processes, particularly private sector processes that they could apply to government that would make things more efficient, would make things more effective. And so I went to work for Richard, and I did that for a couple of years. And that was hard, interesting, but hard. And ultimately I left there and went to work for Mount Sinai Medical Center, healthcare, another
That's a huge transition. At the same time, it's also in the same theme.
Heavily regulated, intersection of
Is this is a theme, I assume, that like a puzzle piece, right? You know, you're putting these puzzle pieces together. You don't really see this until you step back and you're like, wow, there's a real...
What was that?
I actually did see it. I mean, I guess I did see it, and the opportunities would not have been attractive to me if they didn't kind of have that component to it. So I did kind of see it. And because if somebody had said to me, oh, you know, let's go work at the Department of Transportation, I would have been like, you know, or sanitation. I mean, great people work at sanitation. That is a really complicated agency. I was funny. I was watching I don't know if you've seen these documentaries. I don't know what channel they're on, but there was a documentary on the Department of Sanitation that I watched a couple weeks ago. And you just don't realize, one, the elaborate processes that have been developed over the history, the 100-year plus the however long, it's 200-year history of the Department of Sanitation, like starting back where they just used to dump the trash in the East River, which, by the way, is like all that stuff on the West Side Highway and the FDR is all like compost from, you know, it was all, you know, they kind of made Manhattan bigger by all the garbage they dumped into the East River, which was an interesting part of the documentary. But it's just fascinating. And then what they do with the trash and where they take it and how it's like, wow. But that would not have been as interesting to me because that's really government. That's government doing government.
So how did you take being commissioner at HPD and make it not government? Because HPD itself is a government agency.
Well, then so I'm at Mount Sinai and I get a call, and I'm 31 years old, and I get a call saying, hey, would you be interested in coming back and working at HPD, you know, being commissioner at HPD? And I said, sure, obviously. But the thing that I knew about HPD, because I had worked on HPD related projects when I had worked in City Hall, was that there is a significant part of HPD that operates almost like a bank. Like it provides financing. You know, HPD does not build a stitch of housing on its own, right? It works through private sector partners. And that was attractive to me. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that was happening at HPD at the time and was a subject that we discussed in that other podcast, right, that you mentioned, David, before we came on air, was HPD was in the process of disposing of units it did own. And it was doing that through significant partnerships with tenants, nonprofits, private developers. It was also financing new construction. So that was existing housing. Then it was financing the rehabilitation of existing housing through private developers. And it was financing the development of new construction units through private developers. So HPD is all about public-private partnership. Now, there's a part of the agency that's code inspectors and
issuing violations.
Yeah, right. And government, then that's government doing government. And
we're talking about, you know, like the Office of Development, for instance.
Well, that's the Office of Code Enforcement. That's government doing government.
Yeah.
The Office of Development is government in public-private partnership.
Yeah, and that's who we primarily work with at Side and Shine. And I think you do too. We'll get to that. You have a lot of involvement currently with.
Right. That's absolutely right. So you do that for a while. You know, the mayor decides he's going to run for Senate. You got 2 little kids. Your wife says, okay, it's time. As you know, it's funny. One of the things that my wife said to me, so I got married in 96. So it was a year before I got to HPD. So, and you know, it had been, you know, Davis Polk, Edison, Mount Sinai, the city. And so at one point my wife had said to me, you know, the internships have got to stop.
It's funny, like you become the commissioner and you're like, well.
So she was slightly in favor of this because it wasn't an internship, although the hours weren't great for conducive to having little kids. So
What was that like being the head honcho at 31 years old? You're still finding your way in the world.
You know, it's funny. Yeah.
There was just a new study that said you don't become an adult until the age of 30.
Yeah, just
Yeah, your brain is not fully formed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have found in my experience that management it's scalable, right? And I think when it's done correctly, and I think we did a nice job while I was there at HPD. HPD was much different than it is today. One, because there wasn't as much of an attention or focus on housing as an issue, either generally throughout the city or at the level of the mayoral administration. You know, at that time, public safety, quality of life, job one, you know, reduce crime, clean up the streets, broken window theory, eliminate squeegee men. You know, that was the
the goal.
the goal. That was the thing at everybody's mind, right? And the disconnect between population growth and housing starts, that wasn't top of mind in city policy or in editorial board policy or news stories the way it is now. And so that one created an opportunity for somebody who was less experienced to get that job because it was not as high profile a job. And two, did allow for a tremendous amount of trial by error, experimentation, those kinds of things in management. But
the limelight wasn't really
the
shining.
limelight wasn't shining. But what I tried to do, and I have found when I say management is scalable, is you try to find a very good, committed team of people that you can work with that's manageable from the standpoint of people who are directly reporting to you. And then it just fans out across however big your organization is, right? So now I probably, I manage maybe a team of 4 or 5 people, and that fans out to how many ever projects they're working on. There's not a lot in terms of at least personnel beneath that group. And in subsequent positions, right, there hasn't been a lot of personnel beneath that group. But you have to be a really good communicator, a really clear definer of goals and principles with direct team, and then it scales on top of scales on top of scales. But one of the limitations that you have in government is there's so many considerations as to who's in a seat, who reports to you, how people got hired, how they came in. Some of it's political, some of it is tenure based, some of it is subject matter based. So when I got there, right, I think I had 7 or 8 direct reports. And I remember—
What year was this? Just so you—
1997. I remember having a distinct conversation with the deputy mayor at the time, and there were like 7 people on, 5, 6, 7 people, right? I remember, and so I put the org chart down in front of him, and I said to him, okay, just trying to figure out my team, trying to figure out how I can get some people that, I might be a little bit more comfortable working with. He says, okay, let's talk about the team. So put the org chart down. Person number 1 says, good friend of the mayor's. Say so.
I see where this is headed.
Next person. Ooh, good friend of the mayor's. Ooh, did I explain to you how supportive this person was during the campaign? All down the line. Get to number 6, right? That's 1 through 5, right? Get to number 6. Number 6 says, good friend of mine.
Forget the dream team.
Okay. And then I get to number 7, and he says, could care less. Don't even know who that person is. Do what you want. I'm like, okay. Turns out that number 7 was the only one I could count on. The one that no one knew, who ended up, taking over the job when I left and the whole bit. And we, had a long-standing and great working relationship and partnership, even post, the HBD days when she ultimately became the executive director of Citizens Housing and Planning, and where I'm the board chair. So, but then what I did is I kind of hired 3 or 4 people as special assistants and kind of pulled them in. It was there's a funny story I can't tell on here, but about, one person, one of these people came to me and said, they were having a hard time working with, one of the special assistants I'd hired. And I guess I can clean the language up. Yeah. So he says, just can't work with her. Just can't work. I said, oh, really? Why? Total B. Just a total B. And I said, well, that's a problem because that's actually my
Yeah. No, it was without your wife.
No. So that's the problem because
The action would have been much stronger if it was about his wife.
Because I said she's been hired to make your life miserable. So that's how we're going to do.
So she's doing the right thing then. If
she's doing the right thing.
She was hired to fix your mistakes.
Exactly. So it's scalability, reading people, listening. I mean, those are all things that, I think they may not be fully formed, but you probably have at a young age. And then you just kind of go from there.
Well, it's trial by fire.
It is. And I learned a lot. And I think I learned a lot. And I think one of the things that Geraldine Perrine, who was that seventh person, taught me was an intense amount of respect for people who have decided to commit their careers and to city government. There's often a kind of an assumption, and it's totally misguided. I don't know why people have it, that people work in city government because what else could they do? They don't have any options. You talk to people, you listen to them, you understand their backgrounds, their educational attainment, where they grew up, particularly at a place like HBD, the communities they grew up in. Many people at HBD are there because they are committed to improving communities very much like the ones they grew up in, or specifically those communities. They're from Bushwick. They want to see Bushwick better. They know the impact that HBD can have in Bushwick, in Williamsburg, or has had. And so when you start to kind of peel those layers of the onion away, particularly as someone in a leadership position there, you come away with a tremendous amount of respect, as opposed to, frankly, what was the operating assumption that we had in the Reinventing Government office when I was in City Hall, that, you know what, these people need to behave more like if they were in a company, like they were in the private sector. And then when you get to the private sector, you're like, oh, this isn't so functional after all. Why does everybody in government have to behave like they're in the private sector? So I think if you have that as an attitude and an approach, and you not necessarily win people over, but you treat people with respect and respect their opinions about their profession, you can accomplish quite a bit. And like any place you're going to work, there are people who don't necessarily care as much.
Whether you're private or public, doesn't
whether
matter.
private or don't see the bigger picture. Are literal when you need them to be creative. Are creative when you need them to be literal.
Or just, punch in, punch out people.
That's a big change. But the other thing that I came away from that experience with, and has been the second kind of guiding light of the things I've worked on, in addition to the combination of the public and private, is, so there's a guy named Henry Cisneros who was the HUD secretary in the Clinton administration, mayor of San Antonio, congressman from San Antonio, ultimately, most recently has been, an investment banker and some other things. But at some point in the last 10, 15 years, he chaired something called the Bipartisan Commission on Housing. And he's a Democrat and, worked with some Republicans. And when they published that report, they went all over the country talking to housing groups about this report and what they saw as the looming crisis in affordable housing. It was a really predictive and prescient piece of work. And one of the things that he said he always had a period of the speech where and I heard it many times because now at Redstone, I go to housing conferences all over the country. And over the last 12 years, I've been from everything to the Montana conference, to the Florida conference, to the, and talking about and heard people speak about affordable housing. And they were going around doing this. And he had a portion of his speech where he thanked everybody in the room for their commitment to housing and talked about people who work in affordable housing, or the profession associated with affordable housing being akin to a calling. And since my time at HBD, I have felt that calling. I have felt as though this has been more than a job. It's been a great career. But if these issues have been incredibly pronounced, they're pronounced all over the country. And the only way we fix them and solve them is people committed to working on them. And, there's a tremendous amount of vilification of particularly people on the for-profit side of the affordable housing equation. I have spent a lot of time with the developer who's a good friend. And I remember one time, people, some advocates went to his house and labeled him put big signs, labeled him the gentrification king. I called him up and I said, oh, congratulations. He said, what, now that you're a king? I said, you can get invited to all the other king meetings. You can go to the meeting with Burger King, and you can go to the meeting. But that guy is so smart and so capable that if he was only about money, there's so many easier ways to make money.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, that's what our podcast is trying to do. Break those stereotypes of developers are bad people. These are the people who are going out there and trying to build housing.
And there's so many easier ways to do it. And people are doing it because I think there is such a thing as doing well by doing good. I think they used to call it, when I was working at the Goldman Sachs Urban Investment Group, the double bottom line. The bottom line of profit, but also doing things that improve the community. Sometimes you hear impact investing, social impact, right? These are things that are hard to do. This is work that's incredibly difficult. And a lot of people who are doing it don't have to do it. They can do something else. And so I really learned that in my experience at HPD. And it's really now been the next thing that has kind of driven the things that I've wanted to participate in. So whether it was going to UIG, where Goldman Sachs wanted to give back to communities, they were not subject to the Community Reinvestment Act. They did not have a mandate to invest in local communities, but they wanted to do so. I'm sure some people there thought it was good for their brand, good PR, but the people I worked with on a daily basis wanted to make a difference, wanted to improve the community, and believed that they had the resources to apply in some very difficult circumstances. And then when I, went off to the Doe Fund, which is just an amazing organization that I think once you get exposed to what Doe does, which is, helping, the formerly incarcerated and formerly homeless kind of transition into work, because that's the other part of the equation, right? We can give people housing or make housing available to them.
Need people to fill that housing.
But we also need them to be fully functioning. We need them to be able
improve
to
their
pay
condition.
rent. And by the way, we need them to be happy, because careers and work is an essential part of people's happiness. And so going to Doe and working on those things was incredibly profound and impactful. And then I'd always liked the financing side of it. I'd always liked the, putting the deals together. There's been, going back to the Davis Polk days, I've enjoyed transactional work. And
what kind of work did you do?
I was a corporate lawyer doing mostly credit. We did a lot of work at that time, and I'm sure they still do, for JP Morgan. And we did a lot of credit facilities for corporate credit facilities and so forth. And so big loan documents, big borrowers for big term loans. And so I had this opportunity because I'm from Ohio. I got a call from someone I had met in the course of the affordable housing work, who company's based in Ohio, and they wanted to break into New York to do financing. And I said, well, let me help you figure this out. I don't know if I want to work for you guys. I don't know a lot about you guys, but let's spend a year putting it together. So we spent a year putting a plan together. Absolutely love these guys I work with now. And we kind of cracked the code of being able to provide financing to affordable housing in New York by bringing the company into the market. And it's worked out well. I'm sure a lot of that has to do with relationships that I developed over the years, but marrying those with first-class execution and expertise on the financing side, which the company has been a really good marriage. And we've, been off to the races for the last 12 years in terms of financing stuff here locally.
Well, why don't you say a little bit more, because we've heard a lot about, and I've obviously looked a lot into the things that Redstone does, but maybe you could just explain to our Skyliners low-income housing tax credits. I think there's also energy credits. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what your company does and what your involvement is in.
Love to. So there is many of your podcast listeners will be familiar with it. Some of them won't, but there is a tool at the federal level called the low-income housing tax credit. It's section 42 of the tax code. It is
my favorite.
Yes. It's a fun and scintillating read. The tax regime in real property got overhauled in the 1986 Tax Reform Act. And so one of the things that replaced the old kind of limited partnerships that used to syndications of real property that used to occur with, doctors and lawyers and individuals that kind of invested in these tax partnerships, that went away. But one of the things that was maintained and kind of modeled on that old regime was an incentive principally for banks and insurance companies, or that's the way it's grown up, for banks and insurance companies to invest in affordable housing by providing a one-for-one reduction in your federal tax bill if you buy credits, and then all of the benefits of ownership of real property. So depreciation, passive losses, all that stuff comes as the package of stuff that you get. That package, when considered in exchange for the credit, is then characterized as both a return of and return on your capital investment. And so it's about a $20 billion a year market. The accelerant on the low-income housing tax program is another piece of legislation called the Community Reinvestment Act, which was the piece of legislation which encouraged and mandated that banks invest in low and moderate income areas that are reflective of their deposit base. So it turned out, it was discovered in the early mid 70s, that banks were redlining, blacklining, whatever, bad color you want to use. Communities were amassing deposits, but they weren't reinvesting in low and moderate income areas in those areas. So you're collecting all these deposits in New York City, but you're not writing mortgages, you're not making equity investments, you're not doing small business loans, you're not doing philanthropy in Harlem, in Southeast Queens, in Central Brooklyn. You're instead doing all of this stuff in Midtown Manhattan or on the Upper East Side. And so banks are now regulated to prevent that from happening and are mandated to invest in areas that are reflective of their deposit bases. And so one of the principal and best ways to comply and meet the real estate and equity test under the Community Reinvestment Act is the investment in low-income housing tax credits. And that industry, our industry, has kind of built itself up over time where it's highly structured. The investments have done exceedingly well. They don't develop a lot in terms of return. They don't do double-digit returns, but they're straight and steady, very successful investments. And so we syndicate those deals. We buy credits. Well, we don't like to use the verb buy, but it's easier. It's easier if you think of it that way. It's easier if you think about it that way. We buy credits from developers who generate those credits by presenting projects to state and local authorities for scoring, because it's a competitive process. It's a federal program allocated on a per capita basis to each state. California gets the most, Florida gets more than Rhode Island gets more than Puerto Rico, and so on and so on. But everybody gets in. American Saipan, Guam, Puerto Rico, everybody gets credits, and depending upon your population determines how much you get. And once those credits are then given to developers for their projects, those developers can then turn around and sell those credits to generate equity into their deals. We buy those credits from developers and then turn around and sell them to JP Morgan, TD Bank, Bank of New York, and so on and so on.
And it's all institutions?
It's all institutions. We work with 65 distinct institutions. We think in the market we have the broadest institutional investor base. We're by no means the largest, but we certainly feel we have the broadest institutional base. And we have done projects in 47 states, District of Columbia, Puerto Rico. We have invested, I think at this point now, over $10 billion, nearly 700 projects, and over 65,000 units of housing.
Wow. Incredible.
And when I started here at Redstone, we had very limited investments, for example, in New York State, New York City, and we now probably have done, a couple $1 billion in this region. And I, along with another one of my partners, helped to oversee our acquisitions group. So we focus on developers and the buying of the credits. We have a distinct group that focuses on investor sales. And then we have another group that focuses on our finance, our long-term asset and portfolio management. We do this in fund format. So we manage funds, and we have a fund management, investor reporting, K1s, compliance. We have a big effort in that area to make sure our investors get all the information they need, get what they bargained for, and we're out ahead of any problems that might occur at the property level that they need to know.
Has the expiration of the 421A program impacted the flow of your work?
No. So let's talk a little bit about that. So it's a different tax abatement program or set of programs that spur the purely affordable market.
Right.
Now, in order to, and let's just take a step back and just, acknowledge what everybody knows. We have a significant housing crisis all over the country. It is incredibly severe here in New York City and New York State. We have a variety of different tools and have contemplated historically a variety of different tools to provide affordable housing in New York City. We have a regulatory regime, right? We control rents, right? We had historically had tax incentive programs that spurred production in the market rate market, but over time were certainly then used to combine affordable development with the market rate market, 421A, MIH, those kinds of 80/20s,
Right.
those kinds of tools. And then we've had a purely affordable production market and arena that focuses on tax credits, combined with subsidy from state and local government, combined with developer equity and guarantees, and also overlaying sometimes all of those things at once.
Right.
Right. We tend to operate, and our projects tend to operate in the purely affordable market, where the tax incentive programs are labeled differently. 420C, where you have a not-for-profit on the fee, and then that not-for-profit ownership leads to abatement on the project in Article 11. Different types of things, right? Part of the issue that we now have in New York City is a lack of appreciation and understanding of the history of how we got here, both in terms of our production of housing generally and in terms of the production of housing in the affordable realm. There's a lot of misinformation on the part of advocates, developers, elected officials, and the severity of the problem has now also created a tremendous amount of suspicion on the part of everyone.
Got a reputation issue.
Of everyone involved, right? Everyone's bad. Everybody that's not part of your group is bad, right? If you're a for-profit developer, right, not-for-profits are useless, stupid, and incompetent. If you're a not-for-profit developer, for-profit developers are all about the money. If you're an elected official, you tend to be, wait a minute, why do people make any money doing this? It's like, well, let's go to Cuba and talk about that, right? So let's, there are all kinds of things that I think are at play. But one of the things that I think is paramount in all of this, in our analysis, is better education. And I think one of the things that the development community has kind of missed the boat on, and where the development community has kind of lost the high ground, is by not educating the community at large as to how the housing got produced, why it's important to produce it, how it just doesn't fall from trees, how the people that have benefited historically from the work, who are all kinds of people in New York City. And so I think that in this vacuum of information has now come a lot of misinformation. And I think, New York City, it's funny, with the expiration of 421A, right, there was somehow this assumption that 421A, or the concept of a tax incentive program, was new. Like, we've had tax incentive programs in New York City for, going back to 1915 or it's the way things get done. The other thing is a failure to understand kind of fundamental economics. And it's not just supply and demand economics, right? It is the point that in all of the great cities in the world, it is very hard for two markets to coexist at the same. A market for shelter coexisting alongside a market for investment. Very difficult for those two markets to coexist. But I think we can do it. We just have to be thoughtful of how we make that happen. We want New York City to attract capital. We want people who have money to invest in New York, because not only does that investment lead to housing production, but it often leads to jobs. It leads to improved culture. It refines and improves our tax base. There are a lot of things that investment does. And we also want to find a way to shelter as many people as we possibly can in as reasonable proximity to the education, to the jobs, to the culture. We want people to live nearby. It's harder when people have to commute long distances, or when people are double and tripled up and on our streets or are in our shelters. That's not good for anybody. And so until people kind of embrace those two facts and not just focus on one as opposed to the other, we're going to have a hard time, I think, reaching consensus about how we move forward. And I think the governor's most recent proposal was an example of that. Where was the consensus? Where was the people who were pressing for compromise or pressing for ideas that would kind of bring together, or even acknowledging that she had a point? Other than her, where was that happening?
Yeah, well,
and it really
I don't think they could have acknowledged or given her any ground, because that would have taken away their position, and tenant rights for them is a big deal. And if they get their way, which they may, because we may not have a choice, it could be even far worse than it is now.
Listen, David, it's hard in an environment where you live in a tabloid media environment, where the sensational becomes the rule, right? So we know there are bad landlords out there. We know there are people out there who harass tenants illegally. Yeah, but we also know that that's not every landlord. We know that. And we know that that's a minuscule percentage of folks who operate in this business.
Yeah.
But yet, right, we make rules as if everyone is. I mean, when I was at HPD, there was a guy who wanted tenants out of his building. So you know what he did? He took the stairwells.
What?
If they can't get to the apartments, they're not going to live there.
I hope he finished completion before that.
He took the stairwells out while people were living there, right? Now,
conceptually, I don't know how you do that.
They went to sleep at night. When they woke up and opened up the door, right, there were no stairs in the building. Right? Bad guy.
Bad guy.
But you can't make rules. You can't use him as the operating assumption, as your operating assumption, right? You have to say, all right, fine, that's patently illegal.
Right.
We're going to try to put him in jail.
But he's not the norm.
But he's not the norm. And I think, and whether people make rules in that regard, but even an attitude that is what, people are like, or what people want to do is not constructive to us reaching solutions to how we're going to get as many people housed as possible for as reasonable a price as possible.
I'll tell you, I definitely appreciate that perspective, given the fact that you serve on so many boards in the community and on NYSAFA and the city and CPC and city planning and breaking ground. Like, because you're so involved in so many of these organizations, it's heartening to hear your perspective is not one way or the other. There's a middle ground that everybody really needs to find.
Yeah. And, the nonprofit community recently has been been really concerned because some groups have been criticized for initiating eviction proceedings for, holdover proceedings for folks who don't pay rent, who've chosen not to pay rent or in circumstances where they can't pay the rent, not appreciating the fact that in order to, by rule, right, in order to get people the help they need, either in the form of a one-shot or other assistance that might be available to them, you got to initiate a proceeding.
Yeah.
Right? But according to in certain quarters, right, a not-for-profit should never, move to evict. I mean, if we're just being honest, we know that's not right. Like, that's not right.
You need funds to operate the building, so you have to evict. So if somebody's not paying rent or harassing other
tenants, I mean, what about the people in the building who have to live with someone who is either harassing or
doing criminal actions? Actually, we've had lots of that.
Physically assaulted someone, and then they come right back into the building. So these are things where we can't suspend common sense. We can't suspend. And I get there'll always be people who take advantage. We get that. But we got to figure out a better way, I think, as opposed to painting broad brushes. We got to figure out some way to deal with that's more effective than labeling everybody.
Yeah. And Brenda mentioned earlier, one of the things and one of the themes of our podcast is breaking down these stereotypes.
Yeah.
And you can't use these broad strokes because they're just not real, and they're not things that are actually happening out in the real world. But the Post isn't putting, happy-go-lucky stories about landlords doing good things for tenants, or providing housing or sheltering people. It just doesn't. But
really they should, right? And I think that when the heat was off, when there was nothing to fight about, right? I think one of the failings, right, and we used to talk about this at HPD all the time. One of the failings of the affordable housing community was the failure to get those stories out, right? The failure to, I mean, we're very good about taking pictures at a groundbreaking, right? But we don't go back and say, hey, let's look at and you may see it at a benefit where, they'll talk about it, they'll do a tenant testimonial, but we don't do a very good job of kind of getting that into the press.
Yeah.
And I do think the Post or the Daily News would be interested in that story. And I think that is not only the province of not-for-profit affordable housing developers, but there are a tremendous number of for-profit affordable housing developers who have changed lives, have changed people's lives for the better. And I think we missed the opportunity I'm not a developer, so missed those opportunities to get those stories out in a way that would have provided some inoculation of the industry and our endeavors that might have served to help us, over time.
Other states don't, Florida, Texas, other states don't, Montana even. We discussed that just yesterday. They don't have the same feelings towards developers. It's the opposite. They're rolling out the red carpet.
Yeah.
I don't know this. I know this because I've talked to a number of architects and developers on this podcast, as of Camilla and Brenda, and all of them are saying the same thing. Everybody else is rolling the red carpet out. Yeah. What are they doing? Yeah, what are they doing that we're not doing?
Well, part of it is the maturity of the industry, right? We have been here in New York, even before I got here, we have been here in New York actively providing and creating affordable housing in partnership with the private sector since the financial crisis.
Which one?
In the 70s.
We have had so many. I don't know which one.
In the late 70s.
70s, yeah.
Right? And so there's a little bit of a fatigue, a little bit of taking for granted. And by the way, I have no patience for that either, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've got no patience for profit developers who say, oh my God, they don't love me enough. I'm going to go to Florida where they love me. Oh, I'm going to go to Montana. They love me. They rolled out a red carpet. It's a red carpet in Montana.
In Montana.
Who cares?
Sorry, Montana. We love you too.
Who cares?
I can't disagree with you, but
so I've got no sympathy for it, but I understand the sentiment. And I think part of the issue that we have here is, again, the maturity of the market, and that breeds a number of different things. One, it does breed a kind of, okay, we take this for granted. This is what we do. Why is it such a big deal? You're not going to get a star for doing what we've always done. Two, as you have significant turnover of elected officials and people who, for years and years and years, who come into positions of prominence, but they weren't around when all this stuff started. The people that were around originally, when the South Bronx was being rebuilt, yes, that was red carpet time. People jumped for joy with the development of new homes and home ownership in the South Bronx and in central Brooklyn, in areas where the real estate industry had been totally devastated and decimated. Absolutely, people jumped for joy and were extremely receptive. But now, right, people are kind of home about it. And they just, so I'll give you an example. So we have a particular model of housing, affordable housing, that we've pioneered here in New York City called supportive housing. It's a very simple concept. For people who have special needs, particularly people who are long-term shelter stayers, who have persistent issues, the combination of the housing and the services on site, not around the corner, not down the street, not wraparound services, but the building of the services in the edifice. Units above, services on site, supportive housing. We pioneered it. We created it here in New York. It is the single antidote to homelessness. It's the only thing we know. Permanent supportive housing is the only thing we know. It's the most effective way to cure homelessness. If we could build supportive housing for everybody that needed it, right, we would not have a problem.
Yeah.
And
we can't, unfortunately.
And there are a lot of reasons we can't do that, right? A lot of reasons we can't do that.
So people who need supportive services are moving into buildings that don't have them.
Well, everybody understood that. Everybody understood that very simple concept. But now when I go to a groundbreaking for a supportive housing project in the Bronx or Brooklyn, we'll typically have an elected official who's typically a new city council member who stands up and says, wow, this is great. I know we could do this. And I'm like,
Is that your job to do?
I'm like, well, it's not so much that. It's that we're a victim of our success. It's become so part of the profile of what we do that people don't understand how novel it is, how they don't do it everywhere, And by the way, the services are paid for up front, right? They're combined. You get how novel it is, how novel the financing is, how they don't do it everywhere. People don't appreciate that. And then when you go someplace, right? I went to a project recently in Virginia that was done. I mean, you would have thought that it was Christmas. People jumping up and down. They're so happy that, oh my gosh, this is the greatest thing ever. You know, and I would say to them, I'm from New York. We do this all the time. We created it in New York. And they're like, oh, okay, whatever.
I wanted to
to get back to your point you made. Yes, there are now instances where we're doing it without and that was the problem we had in the 80s and 90s when HPD owned a bunch of units. We had put the Koch administration, because they were so desperate, had put a bunch of people in buildings that had been foreclosed without services. And those buildings became very, very tough places.
It's happening still.
We're now back to that.
So we have no place, some places are better than no place, but it's disruptive to others and it's not helpful to those who need those services because they can't get them and they're not going to make that effort. Like you said, it's to the same building. They're going to do it. Jessica Katz, who is, the build up to her in terms of her role and how Mayor Adams appointed her.
Jessica was the executive director at CHBC. So she left our job to go take that job. And Jessica and I are, she's a dear friend.
So that's why, I see there was a quote that you had which said, kudos to Mayor Adams for recognizing Jessica Katz and her considerable abilities. Clearly, the mayor is seriously committed to fixing our city's housing issues. I can't think of a better person to assume the role as New York's first chief housing officer.
Right.
And we were there when she spoke at NYSAFA, and it was interesting because a few weeks later she had resigned.
Yeah.
She had told stories about the difficulties of them going to Albany and trying to convince them that how important it is that the private and public sectors work together because, yes, low-income housing tax credits, subsidies, things like that can fund fully affordable buildings in low-income areas or certain areas. Yeah. But you need the partnership, which is what you're talking about, with private developers in order to do it in Midtown, in order to do it in areas of the city that can't have affordable housing because it's just not affordable to build it there. What do you think, if anything, went wrong? Because there were a lot of high hopes for this position. She's very impressive and has a long list of accomplishments and is clearly knowledgeable about it. I'm not sure if you have any information, but I was shocked that she had actually resigned, considering she'd only been in the position for a year. And then what do you think led to her just not being able to move the ball forward? Not that I don't think I don't think it was something that was her fault.
Yeah.
But what do you think, what are the challenges that she experienced that prevented her from moving this forward? But anybody else, even, more experienced might have had the same sort of experience that she had and not being able to move that ball forward.
So there are two aspects of this that I think are important, and I'll focus on the first and the second. So first aspect of this is if we roll the clock back to the prior administration, and another dear friend of mine, Alicia Glenn, had been the deputy mayor for housing and economic development and all things sundry related to that, and really worked with a lot of people to be the architect around, mandatory inclusionary housing, right? And the idea that you build anything, you got to include an affordable component to it. One of the baseline assumptions there was that you had a tax incentive program, a tax abatement incentive program that would help to make the numbers work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In addition with the cross subsidy of the market rate. And there was a school of thought, and I think beyond getting to the point where we're in Albany horse trading tenant protection for tax incentives, part of the reason that we're in that position is because there was and is a school of thought in Albany, I believe, and I haven't heard this directly from anybody, but I believe that the tax incentive programs are too expensive, and the efficacy of them is limited in terms of the number of units that were produced, relative to the value of the abatement.
Yeah, the loss of tax.
Now that assumed a lot of things that I think that thinking is misguided, is wrong. And it also assumed a lot of things, including the existence of the lowest interest rate environment in, modern history was just going to continue
forever, right? Good times are always going to roll, right?
So that misguided assumption, I think, is where the unraveling of Jessica or anyone's story in Albany to move anything forward. Like that was not, once that became the narrative, once that became the school of thought, right? It's very hard.
It's a non-starter, right?
It's very hard to get anything done. I'll also say that the administration, and kudos to the administration, it seems to have seen the difficulty in the position that they created. There's no job description, and as talented as Jessica is and was, there's no job description for housing czar.
Yeah. Well, that's a cool name, man.
It's a cool name, but there's no job description for that. And that is, without the imprimatur of being a deputy mayor, I think it's very hard to get the levers of government in New York City government to move effectively and to move things forward. And I think, and listen, we're friends. She's open with me. She's never expressed any frustration about her experience to me directly, in large part probably because she knew I'm a person who might go on a podcast and talk about it. But
smart woman.
But I would just say, as someone who's been in government, in city government, that deputy mayor status, title, office makes a lot of trains move, makes a lot of things move on time. And not having that, I think, would make it very difficult to advance an agenda. Now, right? And by the way, the splitting of the housing portfolio, which, the splitting of the housing portfolio, Department of Homeless Services, Housing Authority, HPD, HDC, kind of reporting up to different people. But now that seems to have been rectified. And another good friend of mine, Deputy Mayor Torres Springer, is got it all. And I think we may see that may be enough because, again, another incredible, extraordinarily talented person, very knowledgeable, prior HPD commissioner, prior EDC commissioner. That's another person who's got all the chops. And I think being in that deputy mayor seat may yield to some different results on some things.
Yeah. I think it's a difficult question. There's no real great answer, but we've been contemplating this stuff as we were doing this podcast and beforehand, and getting lots of information from different perspectives, all of which makes sense. And a narrative is starting to form in terms of how things are working because everybody's saying similar things, although from different perspectives. And so it makes sense. The last thing that I wanted to touch upon, at least, is something that I found that was interesting. And I'd not talked to you about this before, is you actually are doing some development in some form.
Oh, yeah.
With a organization called Black Developers Network Triborough, which I believe you founded with Kirk Goodrich.
Yeah. So we have a dear friend named Martin Dunn, who I think is one of the, in addition to being a client of Redstone's and a partners of Monadnocks, who is just a really, really talented developer. And he's decided to exit the business and is retiring from the affordable housing business after a short but inordinately successful run. I'll put it, both in terms of the fundamentals of his business, but also in terms of the quality of the housing that he has produced. And so when he decided that he was going to exit the business by selling the portfolio of properties that he owned, he had a couple different criteria for moving that forward. He wanted to sell it to people who would maintain its affordability. I think that was also an objective of the cities and of all the funders, both the private and public funders of the projects. We were well positioned because we had financed at least one of the projects, ultimately one that we did not end up buying because there were some obvious kind of, in addition to it not kind of fitting exactly the profile of what we wanted from him, there also was a little bit of a conflict issue of us having financed the project, acting on fiduciary,
and then it was a buy,
and then turn around and buying it. So we were uniquely positioned, and then he was, very close to the folks at Monadnock, and that's where Kirk works. And then Monadnock and Redstone are very close, and we've done a bunch of transactions together. Kirk and I are very close, professionally and personally. So it made sense for us to take these properties off Martin's hands. Now, part of the reason that these projects that we were specifically focused on were these were new construction projects that Martin had built, as opposed to the one project, which is a project that he had inherited from another group, kind of taken over from another group and stepped in and refinanced it. And so, tremendous operator, unbelievable on construction. So we felt really comfortable kind of stepping in. Kirk and I kind of played a leadership role in kind of putting the transaction together. Our partners at Redstone and Monadnock, respectively, because one of the things that Martin wanted was he wanted some participation of a minority-owned entity in the project going forward. And so Kirk and I said, well, we'll form one and work with our partners on this. And so that's what we did. We're playing kind of a leadership role in terms of the thinking around the positioning of the project, refinancing opportunities, things that we might do, and of that nature to kind of make the business plan more successful. Monadnock is operating and managing, or they're managing and asset managing the projects on a day-to-day basis. Kirk and I put some money in, Redstone put some money in, Monadnock put some money in, and it's been a good experience so far. We have suffered a little bit from some of the things that we're seeing generally in the affordable portfolio, rates,
operating expenses going up,
expenses, insurance, and reluctance of some percentage of the tenant population to pay rent. We've seen, all these things kind of manifest themselves, but as a general matter, we're kind of operating below projection, but as a general matter, it's okay so far.
Is there any plans for the future to either develop property, or is this is it?
We think that there are a number of opportunities where, like this one, where we're kind of uniquely positioned to add value. I'm not sure that, the guys at Monadnock are so good on development and new construction. I'm not so sure that that's where we add value. We do think, and this is another theme, I'll come back to the last theme probably of the career, and that's kind of fueled my work at Redstone. We do think that there are a number of relationships that we have where we're uniquely positioned to insert ourselves and to insert our partners at Redstone and Monadnock respectively into the mix. And so in places where we can be that kind of calming voice, that assurance that, hey, we can step in here and preserve your legacy. We can step in here and preserve affordability. We can step in here and preserve the commitment that you have to the local community. And I think people kind of trust us to do that. We think that there may be a number of opportunities to do that. Yeah. So
sounds a little bit like a succession plan for some affordable housing. Developers who want to exit.
I think that's a good.
That's a good description. That's very. I can talk to you for probably the entire day, and there's a couple of other.
guests. Likewise with you guys. So this has been great.
Yeah, I'm not going to keep you the all day because Brenda has probably 500 emails that she's tirelessly looking at her emails to make sure that she's not missing anything.
She doesn't seem like the anxious type. She's very calm.
So nice of you.
Cool.
We really appreciate you coming here.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. We really do appreciate it.
And if our Skyliners want to contact you.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Richard at rsequity.com. That's probably the best way to get me, or the Redstone Equity website, which is www.rsequity.com.
You are shaping the New York City skyline.
Dang it, I missed it.
Camilla got it. And thanks again.
Guys,
Richard.
I'm not on my game today.
We appreciate it. We appreciate you trekking all the way to our office to chat with us. And
so far,
amazing.
40th and Park. Right here to 571.
Well, I guess that means we're just going to have to invite you over again. You're just going to have to be like the fourth Beatle. Fifth Beatle.
Fifth. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Well, everyone, that's our show. Thanks so much for listening.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Also, don't forget to leave comments, because we love to hear from our audience, right, Brenda?
Yeah, feel free to reach out at info@sideandshine.com or visit our website at sideandshine.com. We really look forward to hearing from you.
You could also reach out to David and Brenda at dshamshovich@sideandshine.com and Beaslakowski at sideandshine.com.
Those are lengthy last names. You can just find us on our website.
That's right.